I never thought I'd wake up one day and be told my land, 5,000 acres of it, was no longer mine. For decades, this land had been in my family. We worked it, protected it, lived on it. We built a home here, raised animals, planted trees, and watched generations grow. It wasn't just property. It was our legacy. And then out of nowhere, someone claimed to have sold it right from under me. It started with a letter, a plain white envelope, no return address. Inside, a short printed notice. Something about a transfer of interest filed through a local HOA. My name wasn't even spelled right. At first, I thought it was a scam. But then came the calls. A law office, a developer, a title company. Each one more confident than the last. Each one talking to me like the land already belonged to someone else. That's when I knew this wasn't just a mistake. It was real, and it was happening fast. I didn't live in a typical suburb. My land stretched beyond fences and paved roads. But a few years back, the edge of it, maybe 20 or 30 acres, had been annexed into a growing neighborhood. Back then, it seemed harmless. I kept my distance. They stayed on their side. But somewhere along the line, the HOA there had decided they had some kind of say over my land. And apparently, someone had filed paperwork as if I had abandoned parts of my own property. They were calling it an used open space. And using that label, they'd submitted it for transfer to a private entity, a shell company, probably set up by one of their board members. They acted like no one would notice, like I'd be too slow to respond or too confused to fight it, like I was just another old landowner who wouldn't understand how these things work. But I noticed, and I understood a lot more than they thought. The first thing I did was drive to the county records office. I sat there for hours, digging through every form, every file, every signature. Sure enough, there it was, a quiet transaction processed through an HOA loophole. And the worst part? On paper, it looked almost legal. They'd manipulated zoning definitions and exploited small print in old agreements. But the signatures were forged, mine included. That's when I got mad. I wasn't going to let these people take what wasn't theirs. They thought they could hide behind paperwork and technicalities. They thought they could shuffle things around without ever meeting my eyes. They didn't expect me to push back, but they were about to find out exactly who they were dealing with. I called a lawyer, then another, then a third. I brought in a land use specialist, a private investigator, and even a retired real estate judge I knew through an old friend. Within a week, we had a file thick enough to bury their entire board. But I wasn't going to just fight to get my land back. That would have been too easy for them. I wanted to send a message, because it wasn't just about property anymore. It was about the audacity, the smug, quiet way they thought they could erase my name from my own land, the way they smiled and held community meetings while stabbing people in the back with bureaucracy. I wanted them to feel what it's like to have something taken away from you, legally, quietly, completely. So while they thought I was just reacting, I was planning, digging, finding out exactly how their neighborhood was built, who financed it, who approved the zoning, and what land their home sat on. And you wouldn't believe what I found. Their entire neighborhood, built partly on a section of state lease land. Land they had no permanent claim to. Land that could, under the right conditions, be reclassified and absorbed back into public hands. All it took was the right paperwork. The right call, the right offer, and I had all three. Once I knew how they did it, I couldn't stop digging. I spent every evening poring over old plats, permits, and zoning maps. I studied every line of their neighborhood plans, traced every road, and highlighted every easement. The deeper I went, the more cracks I found. It wasn't just one forged signature or one shady transaction. It was a pattern. These people have been bending rules for years, using community bylaws like weapons, rewriting property lines like they were suggestions. But they made one big mistake. They treated me like I was invisible. They thought, because I didn't show up to their monthly HOA meetings or send strongly worded emails, that I wasn't paying attention. They confused silence with weakness. What they didn't know was that while they were printing flyers and handing out violation notices, I was reading legal codes and filing quiet claims. One afternoon, I got a call from an older gentleman who used to work in state land management. I'd reached out through a mutual contact, hoping for insight. He spoke slow, steady, like he'd seen too much to get rattled by anything. When I told him what happened, he let out a long sigh. "Son," he said, "you're sitting on a gold mine, but so are they, and I bet they don't even realize it." That's when it clicked. The HOA's prized neighborhood, the one with the manicured lawns and matching mailboxes, was built partly on leased land that technically still belonged to the state. Decades ago, a private company had signed a lease agreement with the state to develop a portion of land with the promise of turning it into a public-private shared space. Trails, greenbelts, water retention, stuff like that. But somewhere along the line, those plans were abandoned. Instead, that same company sold off parcels to the developers who built the homes. The lease was still active, but it had never been updated. And the HOA, they never finalized the purchase, which meant their foundations, literally, were sitting on property they didn't own. The state had every right to reclaim it. I started drafting a proposal. Carefully, quietly, no press, no noise, just paperwork. I offered to buy out the remainder of the lease and donate the land back to the state for conservation purposes. I framed it as environmental restoration, a move to protect wetlands and wildlife corridors, the kind of language that makes bureaucrats smile. My attorney helped fine-tune the application, made sure it checked every box. A few weeks later, we got the green light. Now I had leverage, not just theories or threats, but documented authority. I hadn't just found a loophole. I'd walked through it with the state's blessing. Still, I didn't act immediately. Timing mattered. I wanted them to feel secure, comfortable. Let them plan another HOA barbecue or plant some decorative trees. Let them ignore one more email from a resident complaining about rising dues. The more normal things felt, the harder the fall would be when they realized what was coming. The day I got the final paperwork in hand, I didn't call them. I didn't show up to their office or leave a note. I sent a certified letter with 2 pages inside. One was a copy of the state's approval. The other was a map, highlighted in red, showing every property now under state review for reclamation. No threats, no demands, just facts. They called me within an hour. First, it was a confused board member. Then it was their attorney. Then it was someone from the developer's side, asking if I'd be willing to discuss alternative solutions. I said I was busy, which wasn't a lie. I had fences to mend, horses to feed, and no patience left for people who played dirty and cried foul when they lost. The calls didn't stop. They emailed, left voicemails, even sent a courier to my gate one morning with a folder of proposals. But they missed the point. This wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. They took something that wasn't theirs, and now they were learning what that feels like, and I wasn't done yet. I didn't need their panic to confirm I was on the right path, but I'll admit it was satisfying. The same people who had ignored my calls, dismissed my complaints, and acted like they had all the power were now scrambling to protect their precious neighborhood. They had no idea how quickly things could shift when a foundation they'd built their arrogance on wasn't as solid as they thought. Within a few days, I noticed changes. They started holding emergency meetings. They sent out newsletters filled with vague reassurances and carefully worded updates. They told residents everything was under control. But I knew better. Behind those polished emails, they were sweating. They didn't just fear losing land. They feared being exposed. Because once residents knew their homes were sitting on uncertain ground, it wouldn't just be about lawsuits. It would be about trust, reputation, value. But I stayed quiet. Let them guess. Let them wonder how deep I was willing to go. What they didn't know was that I'd already filed the second phase of my plan. I'd worked with my legal team to start formal proceedings to reevaluate the zoning status of their entire development. This wasn't about destroying their homes. I didn't want that. But I wanted the county to reclassify the area in a way that limited the HOA's power. I wanted on the record that this group had overstepped, lied, and acted outside their bounds. To do that, I needed documentation. And I had it. I gathered emails, letters, meeting transcripts, everything I could find from public records. I found old residents who'd moved away after run-ins with the HOA and asked them to share their stories. Some of them had been fined for things like leaving their trash cans out too long or planting unauthorized flowers. It was petty, but it built a pattern of control and abuse of authority. And then I found the smoking gun. It was buried in a community update from 4 years ago. A simple sentence, probably overlooked by most people. It read, "As part of our continued effort to enhance the neighborhood, we are exercising our right to manage undeveloped buffer zones previously assumed under community care." That phrase, assumed under community care, wasn't just vague. It was legally empty. They had no right to those zones. And yet, they used that assumption to slowly absorb pieces of my land, fencing it off, planting signs, even threatening workers of mine who came too close. It was more than overreach. It was theft dressed in polite language. So I took that document straight to the county land office. Attached to it were photos, maps, and sworn statements. I made my case. This HOA wasn't just wrong, they were reckless. They were making decisions that put residents and the county at risk. All it would take was one serious legal challenge, and the whole development could be caught in a mess of liability. The county officials weren't thrilled. Nobody likes a mess. But they listened. They had to. The paper trail was too clear. While that process moved through official channels, I began preparing for the next step. If the HOA had been able to file documents quietly and behind my back, then I could do the same. I filed a request for public access easements through certain roadways and trails that ran through the neighborhood, many of which, according to old survey maps, had originally been designated as shared-use paths before being quietly closed off. If approved, those easements would allow anyone, hikers, hunters, even conservation officers, to cross through their streets and open spaces without needing HOA permission. That's what I wanted. Not chaos, not revenge, just access, fairness, the return of rights they'd stolen through deception. As word started to spread among a few of the more observant residents, I noticed something interesting. People weren't angry with me. They were angry with the HOA. They were asking questions. Why hadn't anyone told them about the zoning issues? Why had they been paying dues to maintain land that might not even belong to them? That's when I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting against a system that had gone unchecked for too long, a system that used fine print to bully people into silence. And I was just getting started. They had always prided themselves on control. That HOA board thought they ran everything, from the shape of people's hedges to the color of their mailbox posts. They believed they had the power to bend people into quiet obedience with rules buried in footnotes and threats printed on letterhead. But control doesn't mean much when people start asking questions you can't answer. And that's exactly what was happening. A few brave residents began to knock on my gate. Literally. One morning, I opened my door to a couple in their 60s. They looked tired, frustrated, but polite. They introduced themselves as John and Marie, longtime homeowners in the community. They'd heard whispers, rumors mostly, something about the land under their feet not really being theirs. I invited them in, poured some coffee, and showed them everything. Maps, legal filings, letters from the state. Their eyes widened as they realized just how deep the HOA's lies went. They weren't just facing zoning confusion. They were standing on property that could, at any moment, be declared state-owned. Their dream home was sitting in a gray area, one that only existed because their HOA had built it on shaky legal ground and hoped no one would ever look too closely. They left my house in stunned silence, but they didn't stay quiet for long. Word began to spread faster after that. I didn't need to post on social media or put out flyers. The HOA had created their own problem by forcing silence for so long. Now, people wanted answers, and the more they asked, the more the board panicked. They started issuing letters claiming misinformation was circulating. They said I was trying to undermine the community. But those words had no weight anymore, because now the residents were seeing things for themselves. One man found out that the greenbelt behind his house, where his kids played and they walked their dog every evening, wasn't even part of the HOA's legal domain. It had been adopted into their maintenance budget without proper authorization. Another woman discovered her own property line didn't match what her deed showed. The fence she had paid to install years ago, technically built on land the HOA didn't own. People started comparing notes, swapping stories. Small gatherings turned into heated group discussions. It wasn't long before a group of residents requested an emergency vote to remove several board members. The very people who had orchestrated the shady land grab were now fighting for their positions, spinning tales about protecting the neighborhood and misunderstandings. But it was too late for stories. The real documents, the real facts, were already in circulation. I didn't need to speak for them. The paperwork spoke louder than anything I could have said. Meanwhile, the state had officially begun reviewing the land use and lease violations. Inspectors were sent out to walk the trails, photograph structures, and review changes made over the past decade. It wasn't an investigation exactly, but it wasn't routine either. It was enough to make the HOA board sweat even more. But the board wasn't the only group rattled by what was happening. The developer, the one who originally built the neighborhood, suddenly reappeared. For years, they'd been quiet, content to leave things in the HOA's hands. But now that the state was involved and the original lease terms were being examined, they started showing up at meetings, sending attorneys to speak on their behalf. I watched all of it unfold from a distance. They were scared too, not because of me personally, but because the entire foundation of their profit model relied on no one challenging the legal roots of what they'd built. It was like a house of cards, and I had just pulled the bottom one. Residents began filing requests to have their property boundaries officially surveyed. More and more people reached out to my lawyer for advice. And the media? Well, once one small local paper picked up the story, others followed. Suddenly, what the HOA tried to handle with silence was becoming a public issue. Still, I wasn't interested in becoming the face of a movement. I just wanted my land back. And I wanted the people responsible to feel what it was like to lose control. The pressure was building on all sides, and I could see the cracks forming with every passing day. The HOA had spent years acting like kings and queens of their little neighborhood kingdom. But now, their throne was shaking. And I didn't have to lift a finger anymore. The truth had taken on a life of its own. It was a strange feeling, watching from my porch as residents who once ignored me or avoided eye contact were now waving, stopping their cars just to talk. They wanted updates, they wanted help, and most of all, they wanted answers. I didn't mind talking to them. In fact, it felt good to finally have a conversation instead of a confrontation. Some of them were furious, not at me, but at the board. They showed me copies of letters they'd received over the years. Fines for things like parking their RV for a weekend, painting a door the wrong shade of brown, even having too many wind chimes. At the time, they didn't think much of it. Just typical HOA nonsense. But now they saw it differently. Now they realized those same people were playing judge and jury over land they had no right to control. Then came the survey results. A group of homeowners pooled their money and hired a private land surveyor to double-check the borders. And just like I suspected, a handful of properties had been built overlapping state-managed land. Land that was never legally sold to them. Decks, patios, sheds, even entire fences were suddenly in question. The HOA scrambled to reassure everyone that it was being handled, but the panic was obvious. One couple, probably in their 30s, knocked on my door holding a stack of papers. They were kind, polite, but shaken. Their backyard? It technically belonged to the state, and the fence they'd paid thousands to build wasn't even supposed to be there. They asked me what would happen next. I told them honestly. I didn't know. That part wasn't up to me. It was in the hands of the state now. But I saw something in their eyes, a mix of frustration and relief. Because even though their situation was messy, they finally understood who had caused it. Not me, not the state, the HOA. At this point, the board was in full damage control mode. They called a special meeting and invited every homeowner. They hired an outside PR person to run the meeting, hoping to put a polished face on their mess. But polish couldn't hide the truth. Not anymore. I didn't attend the meeting. I didn't need to, but plenty of others did. And when they came back, they were angrier than ever. Apparently, the board had tried to shift the blame. They said the developer had misinformed them, that they were victims too. But residents weren't buying it. They had the emails, the letters, the documents. They knew who had signed what, and for the first time, the board couldn't hide behind closed doors or legal talk. They had to face the people they'd been ruling over. 1 week later, the board president resigned. Quietly. No statement. Just a short email saying she was stepping down to focus on family. But no one believed that. Everyone knew the real reason. She'd been at the center of the land grab, the one who'd pushed to file those shady documents, the one who forged signatures or allowed someone else to do it under her watch. As she disappeared, more stories started to surface. Internal emails leaked, notes from private board discussions, evidence that they had known months in advance that their authority over certain parcels was shaky. But instead of addressing it, they doubled down, hoping no one would notice. But people did notice. I noticed, and now so did everyone else. The state had officially paused all new development approvals in the area. Until the land status was resolved, no expansions, no improvements, no new construction. That put the whole neighborhood on hold. Suddenly, the HOA's power wasn't just limited, it was evaporating. And still, I hadn't even pushed my final move yet. Because while they were busy trying to keep their sinking ship from going under, I was finishing the paperwork to sell the very section of land their clubhouse was built on. Not to a person, not to a business, but to the state itself.